Well, to start things off this morning, I thought I would give you an artist's rendition of Jesus clearing the temple. That would be Gary Larson would be the artist, and that's Jesus on a skateboard clearing the temple. I don't think Gary Larson read the story, but I had to share it anyway. Now, here's my real question for you. When was the last time that you got really mad? And I know for some of you that it just was this morning, trying to get out the door, everybody out the door, in the car, get over here, or maybe even, with the traffic you encountered getting here. And I totally get that traffic thing, because I am genuinely a non-judgmental person, but sometimes behind the wheel, I find I can be fairly critical of other people's driving habits. In fact, I've noticed that there actually are two kinds of angers, and I think you'll recognize this too, that come out for me when I'm behind the wheel. One is when the person in my lane stops traffic in front of me so that they can make an illegal left turn across a double yellow to get to someplace over there, and just holds up traffic for however long. And that kind of irks me. It's annoying. But that's different from the kind of anger I feel when I'm up dropping kids off at Memorial, and they got a little system of a drop-off circle. And how many times has it happened that some parent has parked their car in the drop-off circle just to run inside and do something? And so, hundreds of cars are now negotiating themselves around this one car that has parked in the drop-off circle. You're smiling because you know what I'm talking about here. That actually gives a different kind of anger, not just because it's a personal annoyance, but because a person's action has affected so many others. It's kind of the anger that comes when you see injustice. It's kind of that more of a righteous anger, which can be a very powerful kind of anger. Just look at the gospel story you heard read. I mean, there's a lot of things going on in that story that are probably strange to 21st century Americans. First of all, what were the animals doing there in the story? Secondly, what are money changers and why were they there? And third, what were people doing in the temple? Why did people come to the temple in the first place? They don't have church services there. What did they expect to do when they came? Well, to answer that question, I think we'll start with that one, the last one. People came to the temple for two reasons. One was to pray, and the other was to offer sacrifices. Because sometimes the religion required them to offer sacrifices at particular moments and times in their lives. And sometimes those sacrifices were supposed to be animal sacrifices. That would explain why the animals are there, because not everybody owned an animal, so when you came to do an animal sacrifice, you could buy an animal to have sacrificed. Or if the animal you brought was deemed to be substandard, you were required to buy one of the temple variety animals that would be more acceptable. That was why the animals were there. Sometimes, though, when you came to the temple, you would give an offering of money, a tithe to the poor. That was an acceptable offering. But the money of the day was all Roman coinage. It had the emperor's face right on the coin. And there was this rule about no graven images inside the temple. So you couldn't bring that money as an offering. You had to exchange it for the temple money. For a small fee, of course. But then you could go ahead and present that offering. So that's why the money changers were there. Each of them providing a valuable service for people who came to worship at the temple. Now, of course, you could just come to the temple to pray. Wouldn't cost you anything. But it was just generally assumed that if you want God to hear your prayers, you need to kick in a little something, a little gift, a little offering of some kind or another to make God more inclined to hear your prayers. And so since the temple was visited by thousands of worshipers every day, the business of those who sold the animals and changed the money was a pretty big business. Now, what do you suppose it was that made Jesus upset about this whole arrangement? Was it the noise and the commotion of kind of all the market and trading that was going on outside the temple? It was in the temple area, but removed from the temple itself? Maybe. Was it the fact that religion was kind of becoming a big business? Maybe that was it. I think you could make good arguments for both of those. But I can't help but offer a third idea, and that's because when I read the text, I hear it with Lutheran ears that are sensitive to any time someone puts a barrier in between the faithful and God, between people and God. Jesus declared, my house shall be a house of prayer, a place where people can experience direct one-on-one communication with God. And what had happened, in effect, was that the religious folks, kind of providing the service, really had become a middleman between the people and God. Basically saying that if you are coming to talk to God, and if you really want God to hear you, you got to go through us. Our 8th grade confirmation class right now, we are talking about Martin Luther and the Reformation that took place nearly 500 years ago. And the institutional church of Luther's day had also become the middleman between people and God. There were all sorts of barriers put in place between the people and God. There was the barrier that the scriptures were still written in Latin, a language which very few could read. Worship services were conducted in Latin, which very few people could understand. Well, what the people did learn about God, they got taught about a God who was so fearsome and holy that nobody even dared to approach God directly or in prayer. You just had to have the church running some kind of intervention for you. And it was the church who was the one who gave out the points or the merits that you needed to get to heaven. That was some serious middlemaning going on. And the zeal with which Martin Luther attacked the institutional church of his day for putting up such barriers is reminiscent to me of the zeal that Jesus showed that day that he drove the animal sellers and the money changers out of the temple. Saying, I think, don't make it any harder for people to connect to the God who made them and the God who loves them. Take down these barriers and let the people come to God. Well, it's 500 years later, and I'd like to say that the church has removed all barriers, but they still exist in different places in different ways. I suppose it's our human nature to put up walls to keep the ins in and the outs out. But on the other hand, I think, particularly in this church, we have made progress, that certain barriers are gone. For example, you don't, on the Sundays we celebrate Holy Communion here, you don't have to be even a Lutheran to celebrate communion in this place. We're not going to get in between Jesus, who's present in the meal, and the person who seeks him. But there are more subtle barriers that we need to be aware of. That even we ourselves can be the barrier for someone, for example, who would show up to worship here, somebody who looks quite different, and then if we choose to ignore them, and everybody else chooses to ignore them, when they leave this place feeling like they have not only been seen but not welcomed. No, every one of us, the Spirit needs to stir every one of us to be little Christ here at worship time, to be able to see those who are on the margins, on the edges, and to welcome them in and to let them know that they have a place here, so that we don't be the ones who put a barrier up between somebody and God. And just speaking of barriers in general, I was just thinking, if you were to imagine if you feel there are any barriers between you and God, what are those barriers? Chances are they're not the barriers somebody else put up, but they're the barriers that you have put up. Your work, your busy schedule, your own passions and pursuits, all those things that we say to God, well, let me get through doing this, and then I'll get to you. Now, there's a lot going on in the gospel story that convicts us for all the barriers we've erected between us and God, or between others and God. But I don't want you to leave the story without hearing the good news, because there's some incredibly good news in this passage. It is good news that the passion that Jesus showed that day in the temple is the same passion that he has for you. That the zeal that he showed for the house of God is the same zeal that he has to make sure that you have access to God's grace. The anger that he displayed that day is the same anger at the sin that twists us away from experiencing God's blessing. It was that anger that motivated him to go to the cross. I think it's the hardest mystery of all to comprehend, that God could have such strong feelings for us. It's very easy for all of us to understand why God would have strong feelings against us, but it's difficult to believe that God could be so passionate for us, for our sake. Jesus is not going to let anything come in between you and him. Jesus, as in that story, is not ever going to stop fighting for you to have access to him. And even now, he is dismantling the barriers that are keeping you from him, whether somebody else put up those barriers or the barriers that you have put up. You are too important to him. He feels too strongly about you to let them stand. And that's the good news. That if our Savior is not going to let our sin or even our death be a barrier between us and him, you can be sure that he's not going to let anything else get in the way either. Because you were made by him to be with him. Best friends forever. And he is a friend who won't give up. He is a friend who will continue to tear down any barrier that gets between the two of you. He is a friend whose love for you will not fail. Amen.